And as we do every Friday, we take a look at the Southern African markets. Well, this week we'll be taking a look at some of the factors that have an impact on what investors would like to see and what kind of role they will play in terms of investment on the continent, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Africa. So we'll start off by looking at those investment flows and some of the factors behind that. Also, we'll look at those risk factors that are associated with investment flows, and finally what we've seen on the South African front just 48 hours ago, the importance of policy certainty and policy continuity, policy reforms that we'll be looking at in that particular segment there. But to help me do this and give us expert analysis, I'm joined by Langa Madonko. He's an investment principal at Africa's Strategic Impact Fund. Langa, thank you so much for making the time to join us. There's been a negative sentiment towards emerging markets, and of course, if we look at the likes of South Africa being a part of an emerging market economy, but look at Southern Africa as a whole. How do we measure up? Are we still going to be able to attract these funds into this particular part of the world?
I think, thank you very much for having me. I think the first point of departure should be to say, yes, there is a negative sentiment around the emerging markets in general. But relating to Southern Africa, I think everybody is aware of the opportunity that continues to exist, but you have to weigh the opportunity versus the risk that is perceived by the markets in terms of their investments into the region. And I think you continue to have some countries like Mozambique and Angola being bright spots in terms of the investment profile and where lots of people are deploying their capital of late. And people start to ask questions around some of the other economies that are in the region. And they start to ask questions around, like you said, policy. They also start to ask questions around issues like the risk factors.
That's right.
Yeah, that are associated with the region.
We'll delve into those other 2 points in just a moment, but if we take a look at investment flows, again, where money is flowing to, the argument of developed markets versus African markets is still very, very big. In future, in the next year or so, if you look at the outlook for this particular part of the continent, is it overhyped when people start talking about the likes of the rising middle class, for example? I mean, do you really see an investment case there? I
think having been to all the southern countries, I think the story is true, but the question is always going to be around how do you harness that opportunity? And the opportunity in Africa is, of course, around capital projects, infrastructure, things that will take a little bit longer to yield the type of returns that they're looking for. But the other challenge that everybody is looking at now is you are facing a situation where you are dollar in, and then the local market is on a kwacha basis, and then how do you hedge against the currency risk and all those factors that go into that. And I think if Africa can start to address some of those stories, in particular SADC, start to find ways in which it can leverage its great potential in terms of the sectors where there is greater opportunities, then we will continue to see inflows. And I mean, the inflows of investment continue to grow.
Yes.
Not as rapidly as we would like, considering how much investment we require in order to reach the milestones that we're looking for.
You mentioned currency factors, and of course that brings us to the second point of the risk factors.
Yes.
That we need to take into account. So next week, when we're all on holiday in South Africa, on the 16th of December, Janet Yellen and her team will be telling us about the interest rate decision. How big of a risk is this to Southern African markets?
It's quite a big risk because you've noticed, particularly on the African continent in general and specifically in SADC, we have now gone into dollar-based bonds, and they are always on a floating interest rate. And now if the interest rate goes up in the US, then there's pressure on us as well. The debt that we have incurred becomes a whole lot more expensive. And with the fluctuation, particularly relating to the currencies which are feeling the pressure of a stronger dollar, we are really hoping that the rise is not as significant as people are saying it will be.
Policy reforms and policy certainty. Certainly the big example has been the change in leadership, who's steering the ship when it comes to the finance portfolio here in South Africa. And I think policy certainty is what a lot of leaders and investment people have been saying they are definitely calling for. How important are policy reforms, and where can we draw examples from that, that the rest of the Southern African continent can start to implement?
I think Southern Africa is one of the places where the issue of policy reform, as well as who is in the political leadership, is a big story. And I think it has a very great impact, because you start to think, for example, in a South African context, you start to think of the story from Trevor Manuel to Pravin Gordhan to Nhlanhla Nene and now to the new minister, and you're trying to look for consistency, because you want to be able to deploy long-term capital in the region, and you want to be also able to anticipate where things might be going. And with some of the decisions and actions that take place, particularly in our sub-region, then we face challenges in that department, and then your measuring of risk and country risk starts to get a little bit more tricky, because even the things that you thought would have been a little bit more stable then are not as stable as you thought. And I think a comparable economy would be East Africa, the East Africa community. They are starting to take measures and steps that are integrating their community, where they are looking for one visa, one passport in the region. They're trying to also integrate the financial systems and try to come to a point where they're also integrating the transport and infrastructure base that they're using there. And I think SADC has a bigger population, so it is a bigger market, and it has a bigger investment opportunity when consolidated. But our policy reform in terms of integration, as well as trade amongst ourselves, as well as that policy certainty that we're looking for, is slower than what it should be.
Langa, thank you so much for coming in and giving us a bit of insight with regards to investment decisions and what investors look for in terms of measuring risk in Southern Africa. Of course, we were now joined by Langa Madonko. He's an investment principal at the Africa Strategic Impact Fund.